I'm a sucker for a good time loop narrative. Sometimes I feel like I'm in a time loop. I wonder what problems in my life a time loop could actually solve. If I'm in the time loop and you're in the time loop, then who's flying this plane? If time loops make sense, then I don't think we have free will, and that scares me. Really? That's the one we're going with? Right, let's back up and make sure we're on the same page about these big bad loops. The particular details of how time loops work are going to change from one story to another. But the broad strokes are that a certain span of time repeats or gets reset until the correct result is reached within that time limit. If the media has a point of view character, they're usually the only one who retains the memories of the past loop. Everything outside of those memories gets reset, including all of the physical and psychic conditions of the world outside of them. Often we see a single day looping, but the time span could be shorter or longer. The successful loop that breaks the cycle could be achieved through anything from avoiding one's death to learning the true meaning of Christmas. So, what in the world does all of this have to do with freedom? Well, in order for a time loop to make narrative sense, time must have certain features. Notice that in order for a time loop to go anywhere, in order for the events within the loop to change, we need at least one person to retain the memories of the previous loop. Suppose we didn't have such a character, and instead, everything and everyone absolutely reset, memories and all. Nothing would ever change then. Every iteration of the loop would be the exact same as the last, because it emerges out of the same starting conditions. Now, I don't really think a time loop is possible, but the trope can still help us understand something about how we should conceive of time. If we can agree that, in a time loop, perfectly identical starting conditions would always yield identical outcomes, and I would like to think that we can agree on that, then that must also be true without time loops. In other words, whatever will happen in the next, say, 24 hours is what it must be as a product of all of the present conditions in the universe at the present moment. We cannot change what will happen. I mean, that's pretty troubling, right? I don't know about you, but I sure would like to believe that the choices I make are really choices. The good news is that several philosophers have proposed their own models of temporality which affirm the existence of free will. I'll be focusing on two such philosophers, Henri Bergson and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, to see if they can address my fears. Can they reason us out of the time loop? Or are we doomed to accept that the future is out of our hands? Let's find out, shall we? Time and Free Will is the doctoral dissertation of Henri Bergson, written in 1889, and it substantially grounds his later works by establishing his notion of consciousness's persistence and permeation through itself, as distinct from the spatial differentiation of material objects. Now, the part of this work that I'm most interested in for this project is his dismantling of two approaches to determinism. The belief that free will cannot happen, because all future actions and events are already determined by the present state. See also my very assumptions about how time loops would have to work. Now, Bergson first addresses physical determinism, which reduces all action and mental activity to, well, physical consequences. Just as we can tell how much an object will accelerate based on the force applied to it and its mass, if we could know absolutely every bit of information about every single atom and its position and velocity and so on, it would be possible to derive how every future state would occur. Now, Bergson does not outright deny the ability to make physical predictions with outstanding accuracy, but he does reject the extension of this principle to our minds. He argues that there is no proof, and there could never be any proof, that a particular determined physical state of our brain, or any other physical part of our personage for that matter, must necessarily correspond to an equally determined cerebral or mental state. And we can certainly observe parallelism at times, where a clear change in the brain matches up to a clear change in a mental state. But to universalize that correspondence is to, quote, settle a priori the problem of freedom. Now, Bergson attributes this mistake to an overextension of the law of conservation of energy. While when he writes, this law seems to be able to explain all physical phenomena, the physical determinist applies it to all phenomena, including the non-physical, shifting the burden to psychological study to disprove them. And that's just not how the scientific process works. So with physical determinism essentially written off as being, well, pseudoscience editors, we can now turn to associationist determinism. This version, rather than reducing the mind to a consequence of physical states, sees psychic states as absolutely determining each other. A conclusion drawn from the apparent motives of our thoughts, feelings, and actions, in a sort of echo of the physical cause and effect that doesn't quite reach our mind. Now, Bergson also dismisses this version of determinism for being non-scientific, relying far too heavily on unfounded assumptions. Now, further, he argues, it would be impossible for us to analyze our own minds to uncover such a relation, if it were to exist, no matter how far scientific technologies advanced, because the necessarily personal and lived conscious state is undone by such analysis, forced to be impersonal, deconstructed into abstractions that lose the essence of the consciousness under study. So, at its very roots, associationism is confusing the explanation of the fact with the fact itself. Now, if we buy these challenges to determinism, then we have achieved an opening where we may recover freedom of choice. Let's turn to Bergson's second book, Matter and Memory, from 1896, to see how he resolves the established and persisting past with an apparently open future. Bergson says that our memory of all we have ever perceived is, well, in effect, complete. Memories are never lost or destroyed. We simply fail to recall them through some error in our mental processes, which may be physically caused, or it may be strictly mental. Now, this may begin to lead us down a path that's very reminiscent of associationist determinism, if we suppose that all of these past perceptions, none of which go away, will absolutely determine our future mental processes. But Bergson intervenes by the introduction of consciousness as a selector. Our attention is finite. When we enter a room, we don't notice every last thing that we can see. Rather, we notice the things that are of interest to us, things we can act upon. Items we can pick up, chairs we can sit on, spaces we can walk through, posters we can read, and so on. Now, choosing these interests is the exercise of the consciousness, and it is how Bergson says we free ourselves. Our actions cannot be wholly determined by the past and the external world in general, because we select what parts of the external world we pay attention to. Now, moreover, we can focus more or less on the present embodied world, as opposed to that aggregate cloud of all our past memories. Now, within the book Matter and Memory itself, Bergson presents this figure as it intends to illustrate what he means by this. When we are effectively in the moment, we are right here, in the plane of the present world. Up here at the base of the cone, this is essentially the cloud of all of our memories. It's not an actual physical space. It's not a part of our brain or anywhere else within the body. It doesn't exist in the material world, but it's sort of field of all of our past perceptions. And as we go through our lives, we fluctuate in how much we locate our minds in this present plane as opposed to in the realm of memories and of abstractions. So at a certain time, perhaps, we may be occupying a space around here, where we're closer to the present world, but still having some kind of reminiscence, some kind of drawing on our past experiences. Other times we're much more lost in our memories, in our thoughts, in our imaginations. We're still in our body, in the present, in the physical material world. But our attention, our mind, is in some ways split between these present and past interests. Now, Bergson describes our different positions within this range as having different tensions. which correlates to having more or less freedom of action. If we were only ever able to be within the entirely material, entirely within the present world, within this plane down here, then we would probably be physically determined, because we would have no choice, no existence other than sheer reaction to the present experiences that we are going through. But because we can move a little bit out of there and selectively draw bits of this field of our memories, we're allowed authority over the choices that we make. They don't just have to be bare, rote reaction. We can make choices. So, there you have it. We do have free will after all, and everyone can stop worrying about it. But here comes Merleau-Ponty with the steel chair! Oh, weird video I just did, my god. Maurice Merleau-Ponty is also a French philosopher from a few decades after Bergson. He was not the first author to develop phenomenology, but he did a lot of work to expand and refine it in heavy conversation with existentialism. In Phenomenology of Perception from 1945, he focuses on, well, the phenomenology of perception. Now, somewhat similar to Bergson, he takes issue with a lot of other philosophers' tendencies to analyze our experiences as though we can truly step outside of them. To Merleau-Ponty, we are always already in the world. The world is necessarily lived. There is no world bereft of subjects experiencing it. As such, there is a very particular primacy of the present as opposed to the past. It is where our physical being and our consciousness coincide. We are only capable of perceiving in the present time, as the present is present by its very being done, being experienced, being lived by a subject. Now, this necessary subject-present relation is, for Merleau-Ponty, the very heart of time itself. He writes, "Time only exists for me because I am situated in it. That is, because I discover myself already engaged in it. Time exists for me because I have a present." So what does this relation mean for our freedom? Merleau-Ponty takes freedom itself to be lived, and thereby something our entire being engages with. Not just our being for itself or being in itself, to borrow these extensions from Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism. Rather, quote, "I am a psychological and historical structure. All of my actions and thoughts are related to this structure, and yet I am free, not in spite of or beneath these motivations, the motivations of making that relation explicit, but rather by their means." Now, this is to say that being in the present is what makes us free. We take up our present situation when we exercise our will, which is regularly happening in our ordinary lives, whether or not we realize it. This is not to be mistaken for an absolute freedom, utterly limitless and unguided in our choices. Our very exercising of freedom produces obstacles for ourselves. Merleau-Ponty offers the example of an unclimbable rock face being an obstacle only to someone intending to climb it. Now, this construction of freedom in time differs from the one that Bergson develops by moving away from the constancy of choice-making that he requires from the consciousness. Rather, the extent to which we get to be free may change across our circumstances, which we need not always take up to the same extent. Thus, the particular rhythms of our bodily expression bear a sort of open fluidity in their relation to time. However, contemporary philosopher Alia Al-Saji observes a walking back of this conclusion in Merleau-Ponty's later work, which actually circles back around to aligning with Bergson somewhat closely. She says that we witness in Merleau-Ponty's later work an abandonment of the framework of the phenomenology and of the sameness of the perceived world as a basis for experience. It is the appeal to a philosophy of expression in the guise of Bergsonism that takes its place. That is, Merleau-Ponty embraces Bergson's work, rather than arguing against it, seeking to bring it together harmoniously with his phenomenological predecessor, Edmund Husserl. Now, this union seems to rest on appeal to intuition, a vision that does not detach itself from what it sees. Clearly coming back to that root that is being already in the world, which has been central for Merleau-Ponty all along. We still cannot step back from our duration, our own temporality, but we are able to conceive of our duration as but one possibility, and to intuit the rhythms of other subjects. Al-Saji asserts that this interpretation of durations, this inter- or intratemporality, forms the flesh for Merleau-Ponty. The flesh is a virtual multiplicity and coexistence of durations. This intersubjective embodiment is, according to her, where Merleau-Ponty builds Bergson's groundwork of intuition into his multiplicitous temporality, harmonizing both authors' work into a vivid, rich present among countless other presents. We did it! We found a solution to temporality that can work for everyone! Hey, wasn't this video supposed to be about time loops or something? Thus far, I've mostly just been running through what Bergson and Merleau-Ponty say about time and free will, accepting the claims they make without interrogation. But I walked myself into this rejection of free will by thought experimenting about time loops, so we really ought to see if these new considerations can save us from that same process. If we take these new explanations of freedom to heart, could a time loop that absolutely resets be coherent? I think that both philosophers must want to say yes. For Bergson, my assertion that the looper would need to retain their new memories in order to make different choices would seem to avow associationist determinism. You'll recall that's the flavor of determinism where each psychic state is absolutely determined by the psychic states that came before them. Now, Bergson argues against this by saying that it requires unfounded assumptions about how psychic states behave, and that those relations would be impossible to prove. While I think he's technically correct, I don't think that our failure to concretely know that associationist determinism is absolutely true is sufficient reason to regard it as impossible. Nor do I think Bergson himself is making a claim quite that strong. Now further, I'm left wondering why the consciousness would select differently in a perfect time loop. There would need to be some dimension of utter randomness to its decision-making. But that seems at least as unprovable as associationist determinism. So, at best, we're left suspending judgment. Does Merleau-Ponty fare any better? In some sense, his explanation follows a similar path to Bergson's, in that there is no clear reason why a total reset would yield different outcomes. Especially since he seems invested in our being in the world, in a way that could even be sympathetic to physical determinism. We are our bodies, and our bodies are part of the physical world, after all. Now, on the other hand, Merleau-Ponty's elevation of the present may be taken to separate it from the past, such that those other possible rhythms we intuit in other people are possible for ourselves. Unfortunately, at least as far as I've read, it's pretty unclear how exactly a given subject's temporality arises, if not as a culmination of that subject's past. So, what are we to do with this uncertainty? Well, I suspect that I've been making an unstated assumption about the nature of time that might not be shared by Bergson and Merleau-Ponty. I take it to be the case that the future is just as real as the past is. Whatever events have happened in the past cannot be retroactively changed by anything that's done in the present. Our understandings and beliefs about them might change, and we might engage with the event's consequences and change those in the present. But that's not the same thing as changing what actually happened. Those events exist in the time and place that they do. The future is just the same way, even if we can't glean knowledge about it the same way that we can of the past. We have no memories of the future, nor are we able to observe future events' effects, because of the way that we experience time. But I believe, just like the countless events in the past that have left no lasting record for us to learn about the fact that they happened, events in the future are just as real, and so they also cannot be changed. What was, what will be, will be. Now, Bergson and Merleau-Ponty's attitudes about the past and the present, though different from each other, seem to be agreed on the openness of one's own future, not existing, not being set in any kind of way, until it is that subject's present. If we take this to be true, then I think the conclusions about freedom do make a lot of sense. And unfortunately, pursuing the question of whether my beliefs about the future's existence are justified is an entire project of its own, well beyond the scope that I set out with. What I think is most important to take to heart is that, even if I am correct and the future already exists, we still lack the ability to know what it will be. So, ironically, being confident in a set-in-stone future couldn't really affect our decision-making, compared to a world that is true to the Bergsonian or Merleau-Ponty views. Either way, we are left to do our best with what we do have access to. Our memories of the past, our perceptions of the present, and our mind's synthesis of both these sources. If we would really be bound to repeat the same sequence forever were a time loop to crop up, we want to give it our best shot each time. Yeah?